Hey guys, this is Eckhart Slaughter. Hello and welcome to another Star Wars Legends lore video. And today we're doing something that I've meant to tackle for quite a while. We're taking a closer look at the Battle of Kamino from Star Wars The Force Unleashed 2. Now, I've actually done a battle breakdown of this before, but today we'll actually be looking specifically at the ships that appear in the video game. Because, as I think you guys will see, there's truly a remarkable collection here. And just as a note, we'll be focusing specifically on the Force Unleashed video game cutscenes and gameplay rather than the comic book, which actually basically skips the battle entirely, or the novelization. So, I mentioned that the ships included are remarkable. What did I mean by that? Well, this cutscene manages to integrate just a crazy amount of Star Wars Expanded Universe ships in a way that makes sense within both primary and secondary canon. What I mean by that is lots of times you see in, say, the Essential Guide to Warfare what the Rebel Alliance was like, then you see a cutscene and it's basically the same thing. X-Wings and Nebulon Bs. That's not the case here. We have two factions using appropriate technology, they're appropriately strong, and we've got references to otherwise pretty obscure ships. But let's start with the Empire. And one thing to mention is that in the cutscene that actually shows the attack, there's a bit of a mistake or a glitch in the render where the Star Destroyers are actually missing shield and sensor bulbs. I wasn't sure if they were meant to be different Star Destroyer types, but in the later cutscenes, it's pretty clear that there was just a mistake in the render. Either way, interestingly enough, we see not only several Star Destroyers, two in the initial cutscene and others later, but also a Gladiator class. The Gladiator is personally one of my favorite Star Wars Legend ships. It actually appeared in Star Wars Droids, but is very aesthetically similar to some of the classic Marvel Star Destroyers. However, unlike some of the other vessels we'll discuss, this is actually one of the most prominent appearances of the ship, which would mostly gain attention later from tabletop games. In my opinion, it's just an impressive bit of extra effort when this ship easily could have been another Imperial Star Destroyer and no one would have batted an eye. It's extra impressive when you consider that every single ship basically in this cutscene really only appears here. The models aren't used in-game later on, and I don't think they were pulled from any source. So it's a nice bit of dedication. But let's take a look at the Rebels, and the Rebels have a lot of different spaceships. It's quite a diverse navy. Notably, even by Alliance standards, the Rebels here are using old technology, which makes sense because we still are pre-Yavin, and the Alliance is still, well, fledgling. First of all, we see Headhunters instead of X-Wings. Headhunters have a long EU history, and I most often think of the one used by Mara Jade or Rogue Squadron when they took Coruscant. But the Headhunter has been in countless pieces of media, including of course the Clone Wars series, the X-Wing and TIE Fighter games, and much more. Speaking though of Mara Jade and classic ships, the other thing that I notice immediately every time I watch this cutscene is the action transports. I mentioned Mara because the most famous action transport was Talon Karrde's Wildcard, a ship that Mara actually served on, and we see other action transports in formation with the Rebel fleet in Star Wars X-Wing Alliance, which itself has some nice fleet shots. Action transports are pretty commonly seen as pirate or smuggler vessels, so in my opinion it's pretty cool to see a famous EU ship inserted in a pretty meaningful way. We'll see more love to the Thrawn trilogy in just a second, but while we're talking about transports, we also see Star Couriers. These first appeared in Star Wars Galaxy. Now, when talking about the Star Couriers in this cutscene, I do think there's a bit of a scale issue. They're supposed to be about Millennium Falcon size, but they look far too large and they just don't really behave like you'd expect a freighter to. For a while, I was actually really confused by this ship in particular. I thought it was something distinct from the Star Courier, perhaps a reference to this background ship from Return of the Jedi, just because it's sort of a weird angle. But yeah, the Star Couriers are fairly prominent. Speaking of small star-named vessels, we also have Star Chasers. I've covered these starfighters specifically in a prior video, which I'll link in the upper right-hand corner, but basically Star Chasers were an early Alliance fighter, also from the TIE Fighter PC game. So again, we have quasi-obscure ships rendered in high detail when it would have been understandable to just rely on Y-wings or X-wings like most games do. We have DP-20s, a fairly well-known Star Wars Legends ship by this point, but which don't actually see a whole lot of on-screen action or even visual references outside of the classic Marvel series, despite being prominent in the EU. Funny enough, when researching this video and the role of DP-20s, I found that the new canon Star Wars comic actually has a panel where the cutscene for the Battle of Kamino is straight up traced, which I thought was pretty funny. On the less obscure though, we also see the usual Rebel ships at various places, including Y-wings, early Rebel A-wings, CR-90s, GR-75s, and Nebulon Bs. We'll come back to the Nebulon B in just a second, but I want to talk about probably the most prominent ship here, and also a quintessential Thrawn vessel, the Assault Frigate. Assault frigates are modified dreadnoughts and were common in the early New Republic era. Theoretically, because assault frigates were modified dreadnoughts, there could likely be some variation between each individual ship, and in fact most Mark I assault frigates have the single prow, while this one has a dual prow, kind of like we see in the Starships of the Galaxy Guide. Although it's modified, this is also one of the nicest renders we have of a dreadnought class heavy cruiser, and personally, I know I've said this a few times, but I just think it's so cool that they went out of their way to bring in callbacks from the expanded universe. But to be fair, it's not really surprising for The Force Unleashed. The first game had General Bel Iblis, also a prominent Thrawn character, and planets like Raxus Prime. On a different but very minor note, one thing we also see in the battle, or I guess the lead up to it, is a ship docking with a Nebulon B. And Nebulon Bs are said to be able to carry starfighters, but we almost never see how. I'm not sure if this depiction really fits with the rest of canon, but it's a little oddity I thought I should point out for you guys. The final thing I wanted to mention is that in the Wii version, at the end of the battle cutscene, we also see a YT-2400, perhaps, but most likely not, the Outrider. So that's fairly cool, and if you watch the two cutscenes, you'll actually notice some differences, and you can find both on YouTube relatively easily. But that's all I have to say about this battle. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments, and if there are any fleet composition or just battle breakdowns of this type you'd like to see me do in the future. Today's comment comes from Jedi Spartan, who asks, seeing as it's canon through Star Wars Commander, is it possible that the Galactic Empire's Project Blackwing had a secret objective of unlocking immortality and used by Palpatine around the Battle of Endor? So that's a good question, and we don't know nearly as much about Palpatine in canon as we do in Legends, so I'll have to base most of what we're talking about here on Legends, but I don't think either Plagueis or Palpatine would have been content with using that sort of Sith sorcery to achieve immortal life. Palpatine seemed more about transfer of essence and, if possible, keeping his body alive, while the book Plagueis discusses the fact that Plagueis was almost totally concerned with sort of maintaining everlasting life. He saw any sort of other methods of prolonging life, whether that was transfer essence or Sith spirits, as basically second rate. He basically wanted to maintain his body and his mind forever. So it is possible, but I don't think it's very likely, at least as long as canon Palpatine is somewhat like Legends Palpatine. And you are right that Star Wars Commander is really only quasi-canon. Thanks for the question though, and thanks for asking so many times. If you guys have a question you'd like to see answered, leave it down below with the hashtag AskEck. Besides for that, I want to thank everyone who wished me congratulations and good luck on my upcoming wedding. Again, it is Saturday. I'll probably be a little short on content around that time. I may have some people step in. I'm not 100% sure, but if I go without a week or a few days of uploads, thank you guys in advance for your understanding. If you want to keep up with my red hot Star Wars takes, make sure to follow me on Twitter and Instagram. Twitter is where I interact most heavily with fans. Instagram is sort of more for memes. I'll put links to both of them down in the description. Again, guys, thank you. Until next time, may the Force be with you.